A single shot shattered the morning stillness, echoing across the vast prairie as Deanna Cole clutched the reins of her panicked horses, desperately trying to maintain control of the wagon that carried everything she owned in this world. The wheel hit a deep rut, sending the vehicle careening sideways before it violently overturned, spilling her meager possessions across the dusty trail and throwing her clear of the wreckage. Wyoming Territory, 1876. This wasn't how Deanna had envisioned her journey west would end. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead as she surveyed the devastation. The wagon lay on its side, one wheel completely shattered, supplies scattered across the trail like fallen leaves. Her chest tightened as she spotted her mother's porcelain teapot, the only keepsake she had left broken into jagged pieces. Deanna dropped to her knees, gathering the fragments in trembling hands, and that's when the tears came, flowing hot and unstoppable down her dirt-streaked face. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over her own sobs. "Madam, you hurt." The deep voice startled her, and Deanna looked up through tear-blurred vision to see a tall figure silhouetted against the bright morning sun. Xavier Blackwood had been tracking a small band of cattle rustlers for 3 days when he heard the gunshot. Experience told him it wasn't the sound of a hunting rifle someone had fired a warning shot, or worse. He'd urged his horse forward, following the sound, only to crest a small rise and discover the overturned wagon and the woman kneeling beside it, shoulders shaking with grief. Deanna wiped hastily at her tears, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. The horses spooked. There was a shot. She gestured vaguely toward the direction from which she'd come. Xavier dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jangling softly as his boots hit the ground. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His dark hair peeked out beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and keen hazel eyes scanned the horizon before returning to her. "Those horses of yours seem to have had the right idea." He moved toward the overturned wagon, examining it with a practiced eye. This axle's split clean through. Wheels beyond repair. His gaze swept over the scattered belongings. "You traveling alone, miss?" "Cole, Deanna Cole." She straightened her spine, trying to reclaim some dignity despite her tear-stained face. "Yes, I'm alone. My uncle is expecting me in Bison Creek. I was nearly there when." Her voice faltered. Xavier nodded, his expression grave. "Bison Creek's still a good 15 miles west." He knelt beside her, his voice softening. "Those shots weren't far off, not safe for you to stay put." He glanced at the broken teapot in her hands. "Family heirloom." Deanna nodded, fresh tears threatening. "My mother's. It's all I have left of her." Without a word, Xavier reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a clean bandana. He handed it to her, then began gathering the porcelain fragments, carefully wrapping each piece in a spare shirt from his bag. "My name's Xavier Blackwood. Most folks call me Blackwood." He continued collecting her scattered possessions. "I can't fix your wagon, Miss Cole, but I can get you safely to Bison Creek." He gestured to his horse, a sturdy chestnut stallion. "Rusty here can carry us both, along with whatever you can't bear to leave behind." Deanna hesitated, clutching the bandana. "Mr. Blackwood, I couldn't possibly—" "You can and you will," he said firmly. "Those shots came from the direction of the Henderson gang. They've been hitting travelers hard these past few weeks." He tied the wrapped porcelain pieces securely. "I reckon we've got about 10 minutes before they come investigating what happened to you." The urgency in his voice spurred Deanna to action. She quickly gathered a small bundle of essentials, a change of clothes, a locket containing a portrait of her parents, and a purse with her meager savings. "What about the rest?" she asked, looking helplessly at the scattered items. Xavier's expression was grim. "We take what we can carry now." I'll come back for the rest once you're safe, if there's anything left." Deanna nodded, swallowing hard. She had known the journey west would require sacrifices, but losing almost everything she owned wasn't what she had anticipated. Xavier helped her mount Rusty, then swung up behind her, one arm securing her while the other held the reins. "Hold tight," he murmured, and then they were off, the horse moving at a steady pace across the open prairie, leaving the broken wagon behind. They rode in silence for the first mile, Deanna acutely aware of the stranger's strength at her back, his arm a steady pressure around her waist. She had never been this close to a man before, certainly not one she'd just met. Propriety dictated she should be scandalized, but survival trumped social niceties out here. "Been traveling long?" Xavier finally asked, his deep voice rumbling near her ear. "3 weeks. I left St. Louis after my father passed." Deanna kept her gaze fixed ahead. "Uncle Thomas is my only family now. He owns the general store in Bison Creek." "Thomas Cole," Xavier sounded surprised. "I know Tom. Good man." Deanna twisted slightly to look at him. "You're familiar with Bison Creek then?" Xavier nodded. "I've got a small ranch 10 miles outside town. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." There was pride in his voice. "When I'm not working my own land, I do some scouting for the army, tracking trouble." His expression darkened. "Like the Henderson gang. Why would they shoot at a lone woman in a wagon?" Deanna asked, her voice trembling slightly at the memory. "They weren't aiming at you," Xavier explained. "That was a warning shot. They would have come upon you, acted like your saviors, offered help." His voice hardened. "Then robbed you blind or worse." Deanna shuddered, understanding the implication. "Then I'm doubly grateful you found me instead, Mr. Blackwood." "Xavier," he corrected. "Out here, formalities don't mean much." As they rode, the landscape gradually shifted, the flat prairie giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen. Xavier pointed out landmarks, teaching her to read the land in a way she'd never considered before. A hawk circled overhead, and he explained how they could spot a rabbit from hundreds of feet in the air. "How do you know so much about all this?" Deanna asked, genuinely curious. "Spent most of my life outdoors," he replied simply. "My pa was a trapper, taught me to track, hunt, read sign. After the war, I came west looking for something that was mine alone." There was a distant quality to his voice. "Found this land, felt something I can't rightly explain. Like it had been waiting for me." Deanna understood that feeling better than she cared to admit. St. Louis had never felt like home, not really. She'd always sensed something pulling her westward, even before her father's passing had necessitated the move. By midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of a small grove of trees beside a creek. Xavier helped Deanna dismount, his hand strong at her waist, then busied himself checking on Rusty while she stretched her cramped legs. From his saddlebag, Xavier produced jerky, hardtack, and to Diana's surprise, dried apples. "Not much of a meal for a lady," he apologized, spreading his bandana as a makeshift tablecloth on a flat rock. "It's perfect," Deanna assured him, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. She watched as he efficiently unpacked more items from his seemingly bottomless saddlebags, a small tin cup that he filled with water from the creek, a stub of a candle, even a small book of poetry that peeked out when he reached for the jerky. "Wordsworth?" Deanna asked, spotting the author's name on the spine. Xavier looked momentarily embarrassed, quickly tucking the book away. "Helps pass the time on long rides," he said gruffly. Deanna smiled, seeing beyond the rugged exterior to something unexpected. "My father loved Wordsworth. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours," Xavier finished quietly, meeting her eyes. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, that neither was quite what the other had initially assumed. They ate in companionable silence, the tension of the morning's events gradually easing from Diana's shoulders. She found herself studying Xavier when he wasn't looking the way the sun brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair, the careful precision of his movements, the quiet strength in his capable hands. "We should keep moving," Xavier said eventually, packing away the remnants of their meal. "Still have a ways to go before nightfall." As he helped her back onto the horse, their hands met, and Diana felt a curious warmth spread through her at the contact. She dismissed it as gratitude, nothing more. After all, what kind of woman would develop feelings for a man she'd just met, regardless of how kind or handsome he might be? The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they continued westward. Xavier kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally pointing out interesting sights: a distant herd of pronghorn antelope, the ruins of an old trapper's cabin, mountains shimmering on the far horizon. "Have you lived out here long?" Diana asked, trying to ignore the growing ache in her legs from hours in the saddle. "Going on 5 years now," Xavier replied. "Came west after Appomattox with nothing but Rusty and what I could carry." There was a heaviness in his voice that suggested deeper waters. "What about you? What brings a city lady out to Wyoming Territory besides visiting your uncle?" Diana hesitated. "My father's debts," she admitted finally. "After he died, there was nothing left. The creditors took everything except what I could pack in that wagon." She swallowed hard. "Uncle Thomas offered me a place to stay and work in his store until I can figure things out." "And what would you like to figure out?" Xavier asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The question caught her off guard. In St. Louis, no one had ever asked what she wanted. As a woman, her path had always seemed predetermined: marriage, children, maintaining a household. Her father's death had shattered that trajectory, but she hadn't allowed herself to consider alternatives. "I'm not entirely sure," she confessed. "I've always loved books. In another life, perhaps I might have been a teacher." Xavier was quiet for a moment. "Bison Creek's growing. The families there have been talking about building a proper schoolhouse. Last I heard, they were looking for someone with learning to teach the children." Hope flickered in Diana's chest, but she tempered it quickly. "I haven't the proper qualifications. Out here, being willing and able counts for more than fancy papers," Xavier said. "Something to think about anyway." The conversation drifted to other topics as the miles passed beneath Rusty's steady hooves. Diana learned that Xavier had fought for the Union, that he raised cattle and horses on his modest ranch, that he occasionally guided hunting parties from back east when money was tight. In turn, she told him about growing up in St. Louis, her love of literature, her mother's death from influenza when Diana was 16. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and Xavier frowned at the sky. "Storm's coming. We won't make Bison Creek before it hits." He scanned the landscape, seeming to make calculations in his head. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles west. We can shelter there until it passes." Diana nodded, trying to hide her apprehension. The thought of spending the night alone with a man she just met, even one as honorable as Xavier, seemed made her distinctly uncomfortable. But the rapidly darkening sky left little choice. They reached the line shack just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. It was a simple one-room structure, weathered by years of Wyoming seasons but still solid. Xavier helped Diana dismount, then quickly led Rusty to a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. Inside, the shack was Spartan but clean. A small iron stove stood in one corner, a narrow cot against the far wall. A rough-hewn table with a single chair completed the furnishings. "It's not much," Xavier apologized, setting down Deanna's bundle and his saddlebags, "but it'll keep us dry." Outside, the sky opened up, rain hammering against the roof as lightning flashed across the darkened landscape. Deanna shivered, suddenly grateful for the shelter, humble though it was. Xavier busied himself starting a fire in the stove, his movements efficient and practiced. From his saddlebags he produced a small pot, coffee, and more provisions. "Might as well make ourselves comfortable," he said. "This storm could last a while." Deanna set about helping, glad for something to occupy her hands and mind. The small space felt even smaller with Xavier's tall frame moving around, and she was acutely aware of him in a way that both unnerved and intrigued her. As darkness fell, the line shack was transformed by the warm glow of the stove and a small lantern Xavier had lit. The coffee bubbled, and he produced a tin of beans that he set to heating. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, a different kind of tension was building, one made of shared glances and careful movements as they navigated the confined space. "You take the cot," Xavier said firmly as they finished their simple meal. "I'll make do on the floor." "That hardly seems fair," Deanna protested. "You've already done so much." Xavier's expression softened. "My ma would haunt me till my dying day if I took a bed while a lady slept on the floor." A smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Besides, I've slept on worse." Deanna wanted to argue further but saw the resolve in his eyes. Instead, she helped him fashion a pallet near the stove using his bedroll and spare blankets from his saddlebags. As they worked, Xavier pulled out each item from his bags, showing a surprising array of useful things: a small sewing kit, extra ammunition for the revolver at his hip, a tin of salve for burns and cuts, even a small wooden carving of a horse that he admitted to whittling himself during long evenings alone. "You're remarkably well prepared," Deanna observed, admiring the little horse. "Out here, being unprepared can get you killed," Xavier replied matter-of-factly. He hesitated, then placed the carving in her hand. "Keep it, as a reminder that not everything that happens on the trail is bad." Diana's fingers closed around the smooth wood, touched by the unexpected gesture. "Thank you. Not just for this, but for everything today. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Their eyes met across the small space, and something electric passed between them, a current stronger than the lightning outside. Xavier cleared his throat and turned away first, busying himself with checking that the door was securely latched. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Diana nodded, suddenly shy. She turned her back as she removed her dusty outer garments, keeping on her chemise and petticoat. The cot creaked as she slipped beneath the blanket Xavier had provided from his seemingly endless supply of necessities. Across the room, Xavier removed his boots, gun belt, and outer shirt, then stretched out on his makeshift bed, tipping his hat over his eyes. "Good night, Miss Cole," he said softly. "Deanna," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "Out here, formalities don't mean much." She could see his smile even in the dimming light. "Good night, Deanna." "Good night, Xavier." The storm continued through the night, rain drumming against the roof, but inside the line shack, Deanna slept more soundly than she had in weeks, lulled by the rhythmic breathing of the man who had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Deanna woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Xavier standing by the open door, surveying the landscape, his profile strong against the early light. "Storms past," he said, sensing her wakefulness. "We can be in Bison Creek by midday if we start soon." Diana nodded, feeling a curious reluctance at the thought of reaching their destination. In Bison Creek, she would become Thomas Cole's niece, the city girl come west. Xavier would return to his ranch or his tracking, and this strange interlude would end. They prepared for departure in companionable silence, sharing a breakfast of the last of Xavier's provisions. As Deanna folded the blanket from the cot, she noticed something protruding from beneath the thin mattress, a small leather-bound journal. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it to find pages filled with a neat, masculine hand. Poetry, she realized with surprise. Original compositions, not copies of others' work. I wondered where I'd left that. Xavier's voice came from directly behind her, making her start guiltily. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry, Deanna said quickly, closing the journal and holding it out to him. Xavier took it, his expression unreadable. No harm done. He tucked the journal into his saddlebag. Just private thoughts, nothing worth reading. I disagree, Deanna said quietly. The few lines I saw were quite beautiful. A flush crept up Xavier's neck, visible above his collar. Just a way to pass the time, he muttered, but she could tell her words had pleased him. They set out under a sky washed clean by the night's storm, the prairie glistening with raindrops that caught the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Deanna was more comfortable now behind Xavier on the saddle, her body naturally finding its place against his. Tell me about Bison Creek, she requested as they rode. What should I expect? Xavier considered this. It's a growing town, not as rough as some, not as tame as others. The railroad's talking about putting in a spur line next year, which will change things. He pointed to a distant smudge on the horizon. That's it there. Your uncle's store is on the Main Street best-stocked place for 50 miles. As they drew closer, details emerged: a church steeple, scattered buildings clustered along what must be the main street, outlying farms and ranches dotting the surrounding landscape. Will you stay in town for a while? Deanna asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Xavier was quiet for a moment. Need to report what I've seen of the Henderson gang to the sheriff, he said finally. After that, I should get back to my ranch. Got cattle that need tending. Deanna nodded, ignoring the disappointment that settled in her chest. What had she expected? That he would suddenly decide to court her after a single day's acquaintance. Bison Creek proved to be larger than Deanna had anticipated, a proper frontier town, with a main street lined with businesses, side streets with neat houses, and a sense of permanent establishment that surprised her. People stopped to watch as Xavier guided Rusty down the center of town, curious about the newcomer sharing his saddle. They stopped in front of a large storefront with Kohl's General Merchandise painted across the facade. Before Xavier could help her down, the door burst open, and a portly man with a gray-streaked beard rushed out. Diana. Good Lord, girl, I was about to send out a search party. You're 2 days overdue. Thomas Cole's worried expression shifted to curiosity as he took in the man behind his niece. Blackwood, what's going on here? Xavier dismounted first, then helped Deanna down. Your niece had some trouble on the trail, Tom. Wagon overturned about 15 miles east. Henderson gang was in the area. Thomas's face paled. Lord have mercy. He pulled Deanna into a fierce hug. Are you hurt, child? I'm fine, Uncle Thomas, Deanna assured him, returning the embrace. Thanks to Mr. Blackwood, he rescued me and brought me safely here. Thomas turned to Xavier, extending his hand. I'm in your debt, Blackwood. Anything you need, you just name it. Xavier shook the offered hand. Just doing what anyone would, Tom. His eyes briefly met Deanna's. Your niece is a brave woman, kept her head in a difficult situation. Deanna felt a flush of pleasure at his words. Mr. Blackwood, Xavier, has been incredibly kind. He even wrapped the pieces of Mother's teapot so they might be repaired. Thomas's eyebrows rose at the use of Xavier's first name, but he made no comment. You'll stay for dinner at least, he said to Xavier. "Let me properly thank you for bringing my niece safely to me." Xavier hesitated, glancing toward the sheriff's office further down the street. "Need to report to Sheriff Wilson first about the Henderson gang. But yes, I'd be obliged for the meal." "Excellent. Say 6 o'clock. We live above the store." Thomas took Deanna's bundle from Xavier. "Come on, child. Let's get you settled." Deanna turned to Xavier, suddenly unsure what to say. "Thank you again," she managed finally, "for everything." Xavier nodded, his expression softening. "Until this evening, Deanna." He tipped his hat, then remounted Rusty and rode toward the sheriff's office. Deanna watched him go, a curious emptiness settling in her chest, despite her uncle's arm around her shoulders guiding her into the store. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind, as Thomas showed Deanna the living quarters above the store, a comfortable apartment with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that was far more luxurious than she had expected. Her uncle, it seemed, had done well for himself in Wyoming Territory. Thomas's housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, a kindly widow in her 60s, fussed over Deanna, drawing a bath and providing clean clothes while exclaiming over the terrible ordeal she had endured. Deanna tried to explain that Xavier had saved her from the worst of it, but this only led to more questions about the handsome young rancher that made her blush furiously. By late afternoon, Diana had been introduced to half the town, it seemed, as curious neighbors and customers found excuses to visit the store and meet Thomas Cole's niece from St. Louis. She smiled and made conversation until her face hurt, all the while watching the clock and wondering if Xavier would actually return for dinner. At 5:30, Thomas closed the store and Mrs. Abernathy put the finishing touches on a meal that would have fed a cavalry regiment: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and an apple pie that filled the apartment with its cinnamon fragrance. "Your young man certainly made an impression on you, Mrs. Abernathy observed as Deanna changed her dress for the 3rd time. "He's not my young man," Deanna protested, settling finally on a blue dress that matched her eyes. "He's simply a kind stranger who helped me when I was in need." Mrs. Abernathy's knowing smile suggested she wasn't convinced. "Of course, dear. That's why you're fixing your hair again." Deanna couldn't deny it. Something about Xavier Blackwood had gotten under her skin in a way no man ever had before. His quiet strength, his unexpected love of poetry, the gentle way he had cared for her needs, all of it combined to create an impression that was proving difficult to shake. At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the store's front door. Thomas went down to answer it, returning moments later with Xavier, who had clearly made efforts with his own appearance. His dark hair was damp and neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore a clean shirt under a vest that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. More surprising was the bundle in his arms: Diana's mother's porcelain teapot, meticulously pieced back together. "Mrs. Wilson, the sheriff's wife, is handy with fixing things," Xavier explained as he presented it to Deanna. "Said it won't hold water anymore, but thought you might still want it as a keepsake." Deanna took the repaired teapot, tears springing to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. The cracks were visible, lines of glue tracing the original damage, but the pieces were all there, the teapot whole once more. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "This means more than I can say." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the rest of the room fading away until Thomas cleared his throat pointedly. "Dinner's getting cold," he announced, breaking the spell. The meal was pleasant, conversation flowing easily as Xavier told Thomas about the Henderson gang's movements, and Thomas, in turn, filled Xavier in on town news. Deanna mostly listened, content to observe Xavier in this different setting, noting how he carefully minded his manners while still maintaining his frontier directness. "Deanna tells me you might be looking for a schoolteacher," Xavier said as they lingered over coffee and pie. "Mentioned she has an interest in teaching." Thomas looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That's right. The town council voted last month to build a proper schoolhouse. Been advertising for a teacher but no takers yet." He studied his niece with new eyes. "You interested, Deanna?" "Your father wrote that you had a good education." Deanna hesitated, glancing at Xavier, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I would be, yes, very much so." "Well then," Thomas said, a smile breaking across his face, "I'll speak to Mayor Hawkins tomorrow." "Can't promise anything, but having family backing would help your case." As the evening drew to a close, Xavier rose to leave. "Thank you for the meal, Tom. Mrs. Abernathy, that was the finest pie I've had since leaving my mother's table." The housekeeper beamed at the compliment. "You're welcome back anytime, Mr. Blackwood." Thomas shook Xavier's hand warmly. "I meant what I said earlier. Anything you need, you just let me know." Xavier nodded, then turned to Deanna. "Miss Cole," he said formally, conscious of her uncle's watchful eye. "It was a pleasure making your acquaintance, despite the circumstances." Diana felt a sense of loss at the finality in his tone. "Will you be returning to your ranch immediately?" "At first light," Xavier confirmed. "Been away too long already." Thomas glanced between them, then suddenly slapped his forehead. "Almost forgot. Need to check the inventory ledger before tomorrow's deliveries. Deanna, would you be so kind as to walk Mr. Blackwood downstairs? I'll be along shortly." With a transparency that would have been comical under other circumstances, he disappeared into his office. Alone in the stairwell, Deanna found her courage. "Will I see you again, Xavier?" In the dim light, his expression was unreadable. "I come to town every couple of weeks for supplies." He hesitated. "Would you want to see me again?" "Yes," Deanna said simply. "Very much." Xavier stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I'm not a sophisticated man, Deanna. I've got calloused hands and simple ways. But if you'd permit me to call on you properly next time I'm in town." "I would like that," Deanna said, her heart racing. "Very much." Xavier's hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "I've known you less than 2 days," he said softly, "but I can't remember what my thoughts were like before they were full of you." Deanna leaned into his touch, emboldened by his words. "Poetry again, Mr. Blackwood." A smile curved his mouth. "Just the truth, Miss Cole." When he kissed her, it was gentle and brief, a promise rather than a demand. Deanna felt it down to her toes nonetheless, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "Good night, Deanna," Xavier said as he stepped back. "I'll return in 2 weeks' time." "I'll be waiting," she promised. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as Deanna settled into life in Bison Creek. Thomas introduced her to Mayor Hawkins, who, after a brief interview, offered her the position of schoolteacher, contingent on enough families enrolling their children. Word spread quickly, and within days, 23 children were registered for classes to begin when the schoolhouse was completed in late August. Diana threw herself into preparations, developing lessons and ordering books through her uncle's store. In the evenings, she helped Thomas with the bookkeeping, learning the business from the ground up. But always, in quiet moments, her thoughts returned to Xavier, the warmth of his kiss, the promise in his eyes. True to his word, exactly 2 weeks after their dinner, Xavier's tall figure appeared in the doorway of Cole's General Merchandise. Deanna was helping a customer select fabric, but her concentration evaporated the moment she saw him, hat in hand, clean-shaven and slightly nervous-looking. "Good afternoon, Miss Cole," he said formally, aware of the curious eyes watching their interaction. I was wondering if you might be free to accompany me on a walk this evening. Deanna felt her face flush with pleasure. I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Blackwood. That evening marked the beginning of a courtship that set the town talking. Every 2 weeks, Xavier would ride into Bison Creek, his first stop always Cole's general merchandise. Sometimes they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. Other times, they sat on the bench outside the half-built schoolhouse, discussing books or sharing stories of their lives. Deanna learned that Xavier had lost both parents before the war, that he had a younger sister living in Ohio with her husband, that he wrote to her faithfully every month. He spoke of his dreams for his ranch expanding the herd, building a larger house, maybe raising horses as well as cattle. In turn, she shared her hopes for the school, her memories of St. Louis, her fears about whether she could succeed as a teacher. Xavier listened with genuine interest, offering encouragement and practical suggestions that showed his belief in her abilities. By the time the schoolhouse was completed in late August, Diana's feelings for Xavier had deepened into something she could no longer deny was love. The night before classes were to begin, they sat on the schoolhouse steps, the building smelling of fresh-cut lumber and new paint. "Nervous about tomorrow?" Xavier asked, his hand covering hers where it rested between them. "Terrified," Deanna admitted with a small laugh. "What if I'm terrible at teaching? What if the children hate me?" Xavier squeezed her hand. "They won't. You've been preparing for weeks. And you have something many teachers lack. You genuinely care about whether they learn." Deanna looked at him, heart full. "How do you always know exactly what to say to ease my mind?" "Not always," Xavier said, suddenly serious. "There are things I want to say to you that I can't find the right words for." Diana's pulse quickened. "Try," she encouraged softly. Xavier took both her hands in his. "Deanna, I've been alone most of my adult life, thought that was just my lot. Then I found you crying by that broken wagon, and something in me shifted." His eyes held hers, vulnerable and honest. "I'm falling in love with you. Have been since that day in the line shack when you quoted Wordsworth and looked at me like I was more than just a rough cowboy." Deanna felt tears prick her eyes. "Xavier, let me finish," he said quickly. "I know it hasn't been long. I know I'm asking a lot, but I want you to visit my ranch this Sunday. See the life I'm offering before you answer the question I'm working up the courage to ask." Deanna's heart soared at his implication. "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, I'll come." Sunday couldn't arrive fast enough. Deanna woke at dawn, dressing carefully in her most practical riding skirt. Xavier arrived with a gentle mare borrowed from a friend specifically for her, and they set out as the town was just beginning to stir. The ride to Xavier's ranch took nearly 2 hours, but Deanna barely noticed the time, enchanted by the changing landscape and Xavier's commentary on the landmarks they passed. Finally, they crested a hill, and Xavier reined his horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Not much to look at yet, but it's home." Below them spread a small valley, verdant with late summer grasses. A modest cabin stood near a clear stream, smoke curling from its chimney. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the hillsides. It wasn't grand, but Deanna could immediately see why Xavier loved it: the beauty of the setting, the sense of possibility in the open spaces. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. Xavier's expression lightened with relief. "It'll be better someday. I've been saving to build a proper house." He hesitated. A house that could accommodate a family. They rode down to the cabin where Xavier had clearly prepared for her visit. The interior was spotlessly clean, the table set with his best dishes, a vase of wildflowers in the center. He had prepared a simple but delicious meal, and they ate while he described his plans for expanding the ranch. After lunch, Xavier gave her a tour showing her the barn he had built himself, the garden plot where he grew vegetables, the spring that provided water year-round. As they walked, Deanna could see the future he envisioned, and increasingly she could see herself in that future too. They ended their tour on a ridge overlooking the valley, the afternoon sun bathing everything in golden light. Xavier took her hands, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Deanna, I know this is fast. I know you had other plans when you came west, but these past weeks have been the happiest of my life." He took a deep breath. "I love you. I want to build a life with you here if you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple band with a modest diamond that caught the sunlight. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She made me promise I'd only give it to a woman I couldn't imagine living without." Deanna felt tears welling in her eyes. "And am I that woman?" "You are." Xavier's voice was rough with emotion. "Deanna Cole, will you marry me?" The answer was as clear as the sky above them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Xavier, I will marry you." His face broke into a radiant smile as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When he kissed her, it was with a passion that spoke of all they would share in the years to come, the joys and hardships, the dreams fulfilled and challenges met together. Uncle Thomas was hardly surprised when they returned to town with their news, though he made a show of extracting a promise from Xavier to treat his niece with all the care and respect she deserved. The townsfolk of Bison Creek were more openly astonished. A courtship of barely 2 months seemed scandalously brief, but the obvious happiness of the couple soon silenced most criticism. They were married in October, as the aspen trees turned gold against the blue Wyoming sky. The ceremony was held in the new schoolhouse, where Deanna had already gained a reputation as a dedicated and innovative teacher. Her students attended in their Sunday best, watching wide-eyed as their teacher became Mrs. Blackwood. Xavier had worked tirelessly in the weeks before the wedding to add a proper bedroom to his cabin and make other improvements to ready it for his bride. When he carried Deanna across the threshold that evening, she was moved to tears by the evidence of his labor curtains at the windows, a bookshelf filled with volumes he had ordered specially from Denver, a rocking chair placed near the hearth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. Deanna looked up at him, this man who had found her at her lowest moment and helped her rebuild her life into something more beautiful than she could have imagined. "I love you, Xavier," she whispered. "Thank you for emptying your saddlebags for a sobbing stranger." He smiled, touching his forehead to hers. "Best thing I ever did, and I'd do it all again to end up right here with you. That winter was harsh but beautiful." Deanna continued teaching, riding to town each morning and returning to the ranch each evening, where Xavier always had a fire burning and dinner started. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other, planning expansions to the ranch, and learning the rhythms of married life. When the snow was too deep for Deanna to make the journey to town, she stayed home, secretly treasuring these unexpected holidays with her husband. By spring, Deanna had news of her own to share. Standing in the doorway of the cabin as Xavier returned from checking on a new calf, she felt a surge of happiness so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. "Xavier," she called, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you." He looked up, his face breaking into a smile at the sight of her. In that moment, Deanna knew with absolute certainty that all the hardships of her journey west, the loss of her father, the overturned wagon, the fear and uncertainty had led her precisely where she was meant to be. In the years that followed, the Blackwood Ranch prospered and grew. Xavier built the larger house he had promised, with a special room filled with books and a wide window where Deanna could sit and grade papers or write her own stories as their children played in the yard. They had 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew up strong and curious, inheriting their father's love of the land and their mother's passion for learning. Diana continued teaching until the birth of their first child, then returned part-time as the children grew older. The school in Bison Creek became known throughout the territory for its excellence, largely due to her influence. Xavier's ranch expanded to become one of the most successful in the county, his innovative breeding practices and fair business dealings earning him the respect of even his competitors. On their 10th anniversary, Xavier presented Diana with a special gift, her mother's teapot, transformed. He had sent it to a craftsman in Denver who had lined the cracked porcelain with silver, turning the damaged heirloom into a beautiful, functional piece once more. "Like us," Xavier said as Deanna turned the gleaming teapot in her hands, something broken made stronger at the mended places. Deanna set the teapot down and wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. "I was never truly broken," she said softly, "just temporarily tumbled. You helped me right myself. And you filled every empty space in my life," Xavier replied, pulling her close. "Every single one." As twilight settled over their ranch, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Deanna reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a sobbing woman beside a tumbled wagon to the contented wife, mother, and teacher, she had become. It was a path she could never have envisioned that fateful day. Yet standing in the circle of Xavier's arms, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of the man who had stopped to help a stranger and ended up sharing his life instead. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, a sound that once would have frightened her, but now felt like part of the symphony of their life together. Xavier's arm tightened around her waist, and Deanna leaned into his strength, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together on that dusty trail so many years ago. "Any regrets?" Xavier asked softly, seeming to read her thoughts as he so often did. Deanna shook her head, watching as their oldest son successfully caught a firefly, his face illuminated with delight as he showed his younger siblings. "Not one," she replied truthfully. "Every step led me here to you and the children. How could I regret any of it?" Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "Even the broken wagon," Deanna smiled, turning in his arms to face him. The years had added lines to his face, silver threads to his dark hair, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had first captured her heart. "Especially the broken wagon," she said. "Our beginning." As the stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, Xavier and Deanna Blackwood stood wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the life they had built together, a life that had begun with an overturned wagon, a sobbing woman, and a cowboy whose saddlebags had contained exactly what she needed to fill her empty heart.